Hello, my name is Sandy Fivecoat, and I will be your host. We're going to be discussing vocabulary instruction strategies that will help your students meet the Common Core state standards. I'm excited today because joining me in this discussion, we have two renowned educators and authors, Dr. Donald Baer, who is the Professor of Literacy Education at Iowa State University, and also Dr. Shane Templeton, Professor Emeritus of Literacy Studies at the University of Nevada in Reno. Now, both share co-authorship of a series called Vocabulary Their Way. Thank you so much for joining us today, Shane and Donald. Okay, we're going to just jump right into these questions because this is going to be, I know, a very important conversation for our teaching audience. Common Core standards, of course, have a very strong emphasis on teaching vocabulary. So I'd like to know what strategies you all recommend that teachers might use to incorporate this vocabulary emphasis into their instructional day. And for example, do you have suggested activities that might be useful? Donald, let's start with you.
Oh, yes, we do. We have a myriad of activities to share, and I think that one thing that's so important is to know who you're teaching and at what developmental level they're at and what they know about the vocabulary. And you're right, the Common Core has just been tremendous in focusing us on particular strategies. And one way we can house this conversation is by thinking about what is vocabulary. And these days, particularly at the intermediate and secondary levels, we're thinking about general academic vocabulary and the domain-specific academic vocabulary. And for many years now, we've been thinking with Beck about the tiers of vocabulary instruction and the three tiers of vocabulary instruction. So one important strategy is to know the vocabulary that you're trying to teach. You can't necessarily teach it all. What are the critical questions the core asks us to think about? We would also ask to think about what are the core vocabulary items, the concepts we want to get at. Shane?
Yeah, of course, I agree with and support what Donald has been sharing. The range of activities depend on the levels of students that we have, where they're coming from, their background knowledge. And Donald is going to be sharing more about that, I know, shortly. We do emphasize a lot with teachers, and this is reflected in the Common Core, an emphasis on morphology, which is defined as processes whereby word parts, prefixes, suffixes, base words, and Greek and Latin word roots are put together. The core targets Greek and Latin roots beginning at grade 4, and that's the same with those states, by the way, who have not adopted the core. Grade 4 seems to be the place, and it's appropriate, where students begin to explore those Greek and Latin elements. But we can begin earlier in helping students understand how these word parts go together, and that too is a part of the Common Core. They list and support the teaching of prefixes and suffixes as they combine with base words, beginning at the primary grades, and then follow through with that. So one emphasis that Donald and I and our colleagues have had is supporting teachers' knowledge base about how morphology works in English. We call it generative morphological knowledge. Once our teachers really understand the system and in turn can support students' learning across all grade levels, this is why we refer to it as generative. When students understand how simple bases and then a little bit later Greek and Latin roots combine with prefixes and suffixes, that insight and understanding can generate their learning of literally thousands of words. So it's a powerful system, and we teach it directly, and a number of our activities support that. Let's take the intermediate grades. If you have a unit, for example, on courage as an English language arts teacher, that's a marvelous opportunity to take a minute or two and just show some other words that grow from courage. Courageous, encouragement, discouraging, and so it goes. That really models that generative aspect for students. And then when we start introducing Latin and Greek roots, you can take a Latin root, for example, such as tract, which means to pull or draw something forward. And it's a marvelous opportunity to teach about attract, detract, contract, and how the meaning of that root combines with the prefixes. So as we said, you'll see a lot of emphasis on the generative morphological aspect.
I was thinking of some of the activities, Shane, and every student has a notebook of some sort. Even in first grade, sometimes in kindergarten, there'll be pictures. They might put together pictures of animals that are in zoos or animals in the water. They'll do concept sorts. But at the upper levels, we'll also have vocabulary sorts and notebooks. And these vocabulary notebooks are where the students can examine their words. Nearly all the vocabulary they learn from high school on or middle school on comes from their reading. And so the vocabulary notebook is a place to look at some of the families that Shane was talking about. And there's so many websites, but the word verify. We also think of word families when we're looking at this generative morphology, and think of all the words that have verify, even verification, or VAR to verify, or VER. All of those will work for us in looking at these larger word families. Or if you're trying to think each of the word procedure, think of all the words that have perceive in it, and try to expand the number of exemplars that we see for our students. So vocabulary notebooks are very helpful. A second activity I like a lot are these concept sorts we've been doing. Like I said, the children will sort, the younger kids will sort by pictures, but at the older level, what I find, or at the more advanced level, I love making them up. I go into my textbooks and I look for the bolded terms, and I start there. And I make up a list of words that fit the unit. And then I develop simple sorts for the students, and I have the basic categories for them to consider. We have several examples in our books. I'm looking at vocabulary their way, where we have elements, compounds, and mixtures. And we'll get to this topic, but that's also a very good way of assessing their concept development, is seeing how well they do on these concept sorts.
Donald mentioned the vocabulary coming out of the reading, and indeed it does, and this is the case across all subject matter areas. Those words do exist in the context of the language of specific disciplines or content areas. So another aspect that we have supported teachers in, and they in turn supporting their students' insights, is becoming aware of, understanding, and applying a knowledge of academic language, the language that specialists in different disciplines use to convey the significant ideas. This is an area where a lot of teachers are being encouraged nowadays, particularly in the context of the Common Core, to think about how they can unlock how the academic language, the domain-specific language, works in their content area, and then share that with students. So as they read a sentence or a paragraph, they are modeling their thinking about how they're making sense of that. That helps their students decode that very special language of that discipline. And then, as Donald mentions, the vocabulary, the important critical concepts that are coming out of that academic language, those academic vocabulary terms are going to be those on which the teacher will focus most directly.
Very good suggestions. I think the key takeaway here is that Common Core really is requiring students across all content areas to assume responsibility for vocabulary instruction. And I think you all have given our audience a lot of good ideas about just what that might mean. Let's talk a bit about the students that teachers serve in our schools across the country. Of course, we know that this diverse student population really can strain a teacher's ability to reach all students, no matter what their level of learning or capabilities are. So what strategies do you all recommend that would help differentiate vocabulary instruction? Shane, let's start with you.
Thank you, Sandy. We would begin with, and this will tie into our discussion as well about assessment quite a bit, But we would want to begin in a classroom first week of the school year in getting a sense of the range of those students, just as you mentioned, background knowledge, reading levels. We hear a lot about Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 reading instruction, primarily in the elementary grades, but the RTI construct applies, of course, across all of the grades. But when we think about, okay, the instruction I'm going to make available to all of my students, knowing that I've got a range and quite a diversity in there, what might that look like? So I may be reading aloud and talking about significant vocabulary terms for all of my students. And then at the elementary level, where I will have a reading, writing, and word study workshop, I'm going to meet with differentiated groups where I can explore further, perhaps provide more background knowledge, extend understandings in an appropriate way for my differentiated groups. Right at the beginning of the school year, however, there are some different ways that I can get a sense of where my students are coming from and their background knowledge. We talk about at the middle and secondary grades a lot, finding out the degrees of knowledge about a particular word or words that students have. This involves students taking ownership for their word knowledge. We show them a word. Have they never seen it before? Have they seen it, but they're not sure of the meaning? Do they have a sense of what the meaning might be? Do they know that word well? And there are a few different measures that we can use, and we share these in Vocabulary Their Way. There are a few different measures that we can use to determine this background knowledge of our students. Another area, and this has been, well, I should bounce the conversational ball to Donald in a moment on this, with spelling inventories that have been developed specifically for particular disciplines. So if I'm teaching biology, for example, I can give a spelling inventory that very first week and ask my students to spell words such as antibiotic, carcinogen, tumor, vaccine. Because of that powerful relationship between students understanding how to spell words and their understanding of the concepts and the background underlying those words, I will get a pretty good idea looking over spellings with my students about their background knowledge in my content area, as well as about their ability to read. So these are some things that we can do, teachers can do in the classroom right up front to get a sense of where their students coming from and then how they can differentiate. Donald, do you want to pick up on that?
Love to. I love what you were saying about the whole class vocabulary study, and then the small group where you focus more at their developmental needs. I think of Ms. Bruscotter. She does that on our video with 5th grade, and you can see her doing 2 days of whole class on simple prefixes and suffixes, difficult ones, and then focusing on open and closed syllable with another group. I'm thinking of also our English learners. So many of our English learners speak Spanish, and there are 10 to 15,000 cognates between English and Spanish that are in common. So a common strategy is to say, okay, now they'll say, I don't know that word, that vocabulary word, but I'll say, well, what's that word in your first language or another language? And so often they can get at the concept by thinking about that same vocabulary in their first language. And we also have the self-assessment that Shane was talking about. We have a teacher in our new edition showing to kids how to do a self-assessment at the beginning of a unit of study. What do they know about antibiotics? And then you can do that at the middle and at the end of the semester of the unit as well. You can look at their writing and their spelling. I also think it's important to have for English learners their first language dictionaries that they can have available. Again, to find cognates and to have some comfort using their first language to learn the second language. Again, the vocabulary is about concept development, and so we want those concepts to everyone, and then differentiate mindful of what they need to read. That is, text sets of easier materials, support by others, and we need to listen to see how they use the vocabulary as well.
Great ideas. Thank you so much. Now, let's loop back and talk a little bit more deeply about this assessment opportunity. Are there formal and informal ways that you all can recommend that might help teachers assess students' vocabulary skills? Shane, can you respond?
Well, there are. We talk about basic assessments in vocabulary and extended assessments. And basic assessments very often are some of the traditional ways that we have used to understand what students know about words. There could be matching activities. We could use this with respect to morphology by having students match prefixes and suffixes with their meaning. It's pretty straightforward. Over time, and Donald referred to this a few minutes ago, we can use the same assessments that we used at the beginning of a unit of study, let's say, as we move through that unit of study. So a student self-assessing themselves on their developing understanding of a word from the beginning to the middle to the end of the unit, we're going to see, we hope, most of those words that they indicated they didn't know very much about or had only a superficial understanding, we're going to see that understanding grow as they self-assess throughout the course of the unit. Donald?
That's right. And going back also, we can just simply have basic assessments that are matching, and we can have extended. The extended tend to be deeper in the thinking, and so we often combine the two. Do you have a general familiarity with the vocabulary? And then where are the ideas? How do your ideas attach to the vocabulary? And those are some of the extended assessments that we have. And by the way, we also look at the foundational knowledge that the core standards looks at through fifth grade, but we also have secondary students who are still working on those foundational skills. The spelling assessment that Shane mentioned, we have a variety of spelling assessments that also tell you about the child's reading because of that link between spelling. When I'm looking at spelling, we're also looking at the reading. So this is a way to bring English language arts teachers together with content domain-specific teachers. And that's another strategy that we have, is to try to bring you together to look at the vocabulary that we can generate together. Because the more exemplars you have, the more phrases that you have surrounding those vocabulary items, the better those concepts will grow.
Both Donald and I have been referring to spelling rather consistently, and about that important relationship between spelling and vocabulary and reading knowledge. But this ties into morphology as well, and as we assess our students' developing understanding of the roots and prefixes and suffixes of a particular unit, we can also point out the relationship between spelling and meaning, which is a direct relationship. We often talk about the spelling-meaning connection. So in biology, for example, there's the word malignant. Well, it comes from a word, malign, which sounds quite different and which has a silent G in it, but we hear that G pronounced in malignant. We help with words such as these and with simpler words such as sign. When you sign your name, we call that a signature. We hear the G pronounced in signature. We don't in sign, but we keep that spelling there because of that powerful meaning relationship that these words share. That insight not only helps students improve their spelling, but it helps them grow their vocabulary as well.
Our students' knowledge of English morphology is directly related to their comprehension of in the content domain-specific areas. So the core standards have helped us to think about this, but it's very clear how closely related morphology, vocabulary, and academic success, how all of those are related.
Absolutely.
That is a really great concluding statement. Thank you so much. Sadly, that's all of the time we have today, but I want to thank Dr. Baer and Dr. Templeton for all of the awesome information you've shared. I know our teachers will find it really helpful in understanding the challenges and the opportunities associated with implementing the Common Core. Now, to our teachers, we would love to hear from you, so please email us at whatcasts@weareteachers.com with any thoughts, feedback, or topics that you would like us to cover in the future. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.